The morning my son removed me from the guest list for his own wedding, I was standing in my kitchen making oatmeal. He didn't call. He sent a text. "Mom, we've decided to keep the ceremony small, family only on Bridget's side. We hope you understand." I read it 3 times before I set my phone down on the counter. Then I turned the stove off, because suddenly I wasn't hungry anymore. People see me now, a retired schoolteacher with gray lokes and reading glasses that are always slightly crooked on my face. And they assume I've always been this calm. They see the vegetable garden out back, the bookshelves full of worn paperbacks, the little house in Columbus, Ohio, where I've lived for 31 years. They assume peace came naturally to me. What they don't see is the decade I spent raising my son Cooper alone after his father walked out. What they don't see are the nights I graded papers at the kitchen table until midnight with one hand and rubbed Cooper's back through a fever with the other. What they don't see is that everything I had, every dollar I saved, every hour I gave, every piece of myself I held together through sheer stubbornness, was built around the idea that one day he would be okay. He was okay, more than okay, and somehow that became the problem. My name is Adele Fontaine. I taught high school English for 26 years in Columbus. I raised one child by myself. I buried my mother, then my sister. I survived a breast cancer scare at 54 that turned out to be nothing but left me changed anyway. I have never asked anyone for a single thing I didn't absolutely need. So when I tell you what happened over the past 2 years, I need you to understand something first. I am not a woman who exaggerates. I am not a woman who plays victim. I have spent my entire life choosing accuracy over drama. What I'm about to tell you is exactly what happened. Cooper was 29 when he met Bridget Hale at a real estate conference in Charlotte. He called me that same weekend, which was unusual, because by then, Cooper and I spoke maybe twice a month. He'd moved to Atlanta 3 years earlier for a corporate sales job, and distance had done what distance always does. Softened the closeness without either of us fully noticing. "Mom, I met someone," he said. "She's different." I asked what he meant by different. He laughed a little. "She just knows exactly what she wants. She's driven. She's got this whole plan for everything." I told him that sounded wonderful. I meant it. The first time I met Bridget Hale was Thanksgiving, 8 months after that phone call. Cooper drove us to her parents' home in Buckhead. The house sat behind iron gates at the end of a long driveway, lined with Bradford pear trees. It was the kind of house that makes you instinctively smooth your clothes before you knock. Bridget was beautiful in an assembled way. Every detail of her appearance looked considered. She greeted me at the door, with a smile that was warm enough to be polite and cool enough to remind me I was a guest. Her father, Whitfield Hale, wore a blazer to Thanksgiving dinner and talked about investment properties the way other men talk about sports. Her mother, Suzanne Hale, floated through the house, adjusting flower arrangements and complimenting things that didn't need complimenting. The wine, the lighting, the choice of centerpiece, in a voice that made everything sound like an audition. I wore my good navy dress, the one I bought for my retirement ceremony. At dinner, Suzanne asked what I'd done before retiring. I told her I taught English. "How lovely," she said in the tone people use when they mean something closer to, "How modest." Whitfield asked which school. I told him. He nodded without recognition and immediately turned to ask Cooper about his Q4 numbers. I remember watching Cooper straighten slightly in his chair when Whitfield spoke to him, like a man adjusting his posture for an audience. That was the first time I felt something I couldn't quite name. Not alarm. Not even concern. More like the quiet recognition of a pattern I'd read about in books, but never expected to see in my own kitchen. The engagement came 14 months later. Cooper called me on a Tuesday morning, and for a moment, hearing his voice, I thought of the little boy who used to drag his blanket into my bedroom during thunderstorms and ask me to tell him stories about places I'd never been. "We're getting married," he said. "Next October," I cried, genuinely. "Happy tears, the kind that catch you before you're ready." I told him I was thrilled. I asked when we could start talking about the details. There was a brief pause. "Bridget's parents are handling most of it." I said that was fine. I offered to help wherever I could. I asked about the rehearsal dinner, whether that was something I could host or contribute to. Another pause. "We'll figure it out. Bridget's got a vision." I told him, of course. I told him whatever worked best for them. I hung up and sat for a while in my living room looking at a framed photograph on the bookshelf. Cooper at his high school graduation. He had his father's jawline in my eyes, and that day he'd grabbed my hand in the parking lot before the ceremony started and said, "I wouldn't have made it without you, Mom." I had believed him completely. After the engagement, I started noticing small changes in how Cooper spoke to me. Not sudden, gradual. The way fog settles. You don't see it arriving. You just realize at some point that the view has changed. He started calling less. When we did speak, there was a new carefulness in his voice, like he was editing himself before each sentence. Once, I mentioned I'd love to visit Atlanta to see the apartment they'd just moved into together. He said, "Yeah, let's find a time." And then time passed and the subject didn't come up again. I told myself he was busy. Engaged couples are busy. I told myself. Bridget had a strong personality and Cooper was adjusting to sharing his life. I told myself 100 reasonable things because that is what mothers do. We build reasonable explanations out of whatever materials we have available, because the unreasonable explanation hurts too much to hold. Then came the text about the wedding. I called Cooper immediately. He answered on the 4th ring, which told me he'd seen my name and waited. "Cooper, what does this mean?" "Mom, I told you. They're keeping it small. You said family only on Bridget's side. I'm your family. I'm your only family." A long silence. Then, "Bridget feels like it would create some tension. Her family is they have a certain kind of dynamic at events. It's not personal." I asked him to explain what he meant by tension. He couldn't or wouldn't. He kept using the word dynamic as though it explained something. I finally asked directly, "Did Bridget ask you not to invite me?" He didn't answer immediately. That silence told me everything. Before I could say another word, he said, "I think we should talk about this later when you're not upset." I was not upset. I was devastated, which is entirely different. But I said fine. I said fine, and I hung up. That afternoon, I sat in my garden for a long time, just looking at the tomato plants I'd been tending since April. I am the kind of woman who thinks best in a garden, something about the permanence of roots. I thought about the money. Here is something I hadn't told anyone. 3 years earlier, when Cooper moved to Atlanta and was getting settled, I had quietly begun helping him, financially. Not dramatically, nothing that required conversation or gratitude. I simply made things easier. His car had been giving him trouble, and I covered the repair bills without being asked. When he got the new apartment, I sent a check toward the security deposit because first months in Atlanta were expensive and he was just starting out. After the engagement, I agreed to contribute to the wedding fund. A number Bridget had actually mentioned to me directly during one of our few phone conversations. I'd written a check for $12,000. That check had been cashed 6 weeks before the text about the guest list. I hadn't brought it up after the text. Not immediately. Some part of me still wanted to believe there had been a misunderstanding. Some part of me was still constructing reasonable explanations. But reason has limits. About a week after the text, my oldest friend, a woman named Harriet who'd known me since we taught at the same middle school in the 90s, came over for coffee. I told her everything. She sat across my kitchen table with her mug in both hands and listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about her. When I finished, she put down her mug. "A deal. That $12,000 is gone." "I know, and they used it toward a wedding you're not invited to." I hadn't said it out loud before. Hearing Harriet say it made the air feel strange, like the room had shifted slightly on its axis. That evening, I pulled out my bank statements. I hadn't looked at the full picture in a while because I trusted. That's the word that matters. I trusted. I trusted in the way people trust family, which is differently than they trust strangers. You don't audit people you love. But sitting there at my kitchen table, I started adding things up. The car repairs over 2 separate occasions, the security deposit, the wedding contribution. There had also been a moment 18 months earlier when Cooper mentioned Bridget was between jobs and asked whether I could help with a few months of expenses just until she lands something. I had said yes. I had transferred money to his account over a period of 4 months. I wrote the total in the margin of my legal pad. Then I stared at it for a while. I wasn't angry about the money. I want to be honest about that because it's important. I would have given Cooper everything I had if he needed it and asked honestly. What made my chest feel like stone sitting there at that table was not the number. It was the understanding of what the number meant. It meant I had been funding my own erasure. I called my financial advisor the next morning. Her name is Beverly Osei. She has a steady voice and a gift for saying difficult things without making you feel stupid for not having seen them yourself. I asked her to review everything connected to the support I'd been giving Cooper over the past 3 years. Her callback came that afternoon. She walked me through what I already knew, but hearing it organized and summarized by someone else has its own particular weight. Then she said something that stopped me. Adil, are you aware that your name was used on a rental lease application in Atlanta last year? I was not aware of that, she explained carefully. At some point, someone, Cooper or Bridget, she couldn't say, had listed me as a financial cosigner on an upgraded apartment lease without my direct authorization. The documentation had been submitted with a copy of an old reference letter I'd written for Cooper years ago for a job application, and someone had filled in additional lines. My handwriting, not my hand. I sat with that information for a long moment before I asked Beverly to send me the full file. After we hung up, I went out to the garden. I needed air. The tomatoes were coming in well, bright red against the afternoon light, and for a moment I just stood there with my hand around one that wasn't quite ripe yet, and thought about how you can watch something grow for months and still not know exactly when it'll be ready. I called my attorney that evening. His name is Leonard Price. He's been my attorney since I bought this house, a quiet man who doesn't alarm easily and has a gift for distinguishing between what is genuinely urgent and what only feels that way. I told him about the lease documentation. I told him about the forged reference conversion. He was quiet for several seconds. Adil, he said carefully, this may constitute unauthorized use of your identity in a financial context. He used the word carefully, the way lawyers do when they mean something serious but don't want to detonate the room before they're ready. What do I do? I asked. First, he said, don't signal anything to Cooper yet. Let me pull the documents and verify. Then we talk. I didn't sleep well that night. Not because of anger. The anger was still forming, still taking shape somewhere deep below the surface. I didn't sleep because I kept replaying every conversation I'd had with Cooper over the past 2 years, trying to locate the moment where my son stopped being my son and started being someone I didn't fully recognize. I couldn't find it. That was the worst part. It hadn't happened in one moment. It had happened in the slow accumulation of 100 small moments, each one individually explainable, only visible as a pattern when you looked at all of them together. 3 days later, Leonard called. The documentation is a problem, he said. The reference letter was clearly altered. Your name and contact information were used to satisfy Skyner requirements. Whoever did this was banking on no one looking closely. Can you tell who did it? A pause. The application was filed under Cooper's name, but the alterations they're detailed. They required access to the original letter, and they required someone comfortable enough with documents to know what a lease office was accept. I thought about Whitfield Hale and his investment properties. I thought about Bridget's composed, careful precision. I need you to preserve everything, I told Leonard. Don't act yet. I need to talk to my son first. That conversation was the one I had been building courage for without realizing it. Cooper came to Columbus 2 weekends later. I hadn't told him why I needed to see him in person. I'd only said I wanted to talk. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon looking polished and slightly defensive, the way people look when they're bracing for something they half expect. I had made coffee. I had not made anything else, which he probably noticed because I always feed people when they come to my house. We sat at the kitchen table. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked him, simply, do you know about the lease application? His face changed, not dramatically. A small, specific change around the eyes. The kind that only registers if you've been reading someone's face since they were 2 days old. Mom, Cooper! My voice surprised me. It was very calm. I need you to tell me the truth. What came out over the next hour was not a confession so much as a slow, painful unraveling. He tried to minimize at first. It was administrative. Bridget handled the paperwork. He hadn't thought through the implications. It was just to qualify for the building. I sat quietly through each layer. I've been a teacher long enough to know that people reveal themselves at their own pace when you stop interrupting. By the end, he looked young. That's the only word for it. Underneath the blazer and the Atlanta address, and the whole assembled version of the man Bridget seemed to be building him in two. He looked like a boy who had done something he couldn't quite justify to himself. Bridget said it would only matter if something went wrong, he said finally. And nothing was going to go wrong. Something went wrong, I said quietly. He put his face in his hands. I asked him about the wedding, about the text, about whether the decision to exclude me had come from him. He was quiet for a long time. Then, she said you didn't fit the image they were going for. The sentence landed with a kind of dull precision. She said your background was. He stopped. My background, I repeated. He couldn't finish it. He didn't have to. I had been a public school teacher. I drove a 7-year-old Civic. I wore my good Navy dress to Thanksgiving, and still managed to feel somehow insufficient. I understood exactly what my background was in Bridget Hale's categorization of the world. And you agreed, I said. Not a question. The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. After Cooper left that afternoon, I walked through my house slowly. I stood in the doorway of the room that used to be his bedroom, which is now my sewing room. A few of his old track trophies still sat on the shelf because I could never bring myself to take them down. I looked at them for a long time. Then I went to my desk and made 3 calls. The first was to Beverly O.C. I asked her to suspend the automatic transfers I'd been running into Cooper's account. A smaller amount I hadn't even mentioned yet, a quiet monthly supplement I'd started 2 years ago when he was building his savings. He didn't know about it. He'd never asked. I had simply been sending it because that is what I had always done. Quietly made things easier for my son without requiring acknowledgement. The second call was to Leonard Price. I told him to proceed with formally documenting the unauthorized lease use. Not to file anything yet, just to have it ready. The third call was to Beverly again, to ask her to flag any future financial instruments that carried my name. That night was very quiet. I made soup and sat by the window, watching the streetlight. Come on, that particular moment in early evening when the light outside shifts from natural to artificial, and the whole neighborhood looks briefly like a painting. I thought about how. I used to tell my students that the most important sentences in any story are the ones the character doesn't say out loud. Cooper didn't call for 11 days. When he did, it was 10 o'clock at night, and even before I answered, I could hear something different in the sound of the call. Not the defensive preparation from 2 weekends ago. Something closer to fracture. Mom, he said, Bridget and I had a fight. I waited. About you. About the wedding. He stopped. About a lot of things. I asked if he wanted to tell me what happened. What came through over the next 20 minutes was difficult to hear, not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. It was small and accumulated, the same way everything important had been in this story. Bridget had been meticulous about the wedding image. Every vendor, every seat, every photograph had been managed with a precision that Cooper had initially admired, and was only now beginning to understand was also control. He had mentioned to her that he was having second thoughts about the guest list. She had responded in a way that made him feel, he said, like I'd made an error in judgment. That phrase stayed with me. An error in judgment. Not like he had hurt someone. Like he had made an administrative mistake. He also told me something I hadn't known. Bridget's father, Whitfield Hale, had been quietly mentoring Cooper in his business dealings for the past year. Dinners, introductions, opportunities that required a certain social profile to access. And Whitfield had made clear, in that careful way that rich men make things clear without ever quite saying them directly, that the profile needed to be consistent, clean, polished, without what he called distractions. I was the distraction. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked Cooper, do you believe that about me? That I'm a distraction? The silence before he answered was the longest silence of the entire conversation. No, he finally said. I don't, but you let her. He didn't argue with that. I asked him a question I'd been carrying for months. When did you stop being afraid to disappoint me and start being afraid to disappoint them? He didn't answer immediately. I heard him exhale. Then, I don't know, Mom. I really don't know. That sentence was the most honest thing he'd said to me in over a year. and somewhere inside the hurt, I recognized it as the beginning of something. I told him about the financial support I'd been giving him. All of it, including the monthly transfers he hadn't known about. I laid it out plainly, not to wound him, but because he needed to see the full picture to understand what the full picture meant. The silence after that was a different kind. "Mom," he said quietly, "I didn't know about the monthly. I know, I didn't ask for that. I know, that's partly on me." I paused. "But, Cooper, you did know about the $12,000. You knew it paid for a wedding I wasn't going to be at." I heard him make a sound that wasn't quite a word. "And someone used my name on a lease application," I said. "I need to know how much you understood about that when it happened." Another long pause. Then, "She said it was just a formality, that my income wasn't quite enough alone for the building they wanted. She said you'd never know." "She was right that I might not have known," I said. "But I do know. And Leonard Price knows. And Beverly Osei has everything documented." He went very quiet. I wasn't trying to threaten him. I want to be clear about that. I was trying to make sure he understood that the quiet, accommodating woman who mailed birthday cards and stayed in her lane had been paying attention, had always been paying attention. The next week was difficult. Cooper and I spoke twice more, short calls that felt careful and uncertain, like two people walking across ice and testing each step. I found out through him that Bridget had not taken the conversation about the guest list gracefully. There had been more fighting. Whitfield had apparently called Cooper directly to smooth things over, which Cooper described as more pressure dressed up as advice. Then Leonard called on a Thursday morning. "Adel," he said carefully, "I've heard from someone at the county recorder's office. It appears the lease application issue may be connected to a broader pattern of financial documentation tied to the Hale family's real estate operation." I put down my coffee cup. "What kind of pattern?" He explained it as slowly and clearly as he could. Whitfield Hale's investment portfolio, it turned out, was not quite what its surface suggested. There were properties with documentation irregularities. There were names on financial instruments that may not have been fully authorized. My situation was small by comparison, but it was consistent with a method. "Is Cooper at legal risk?" I asked. That was my first question. Not about me, about him. Leonard paused in a way that told me he'd expected the question. "He may have been used," he said carefully. "He may also have made choices he didn't fully think through. We'll need to be careful." I spent 2 hours that afternoon sitting in my garden. Not thinking, exactly. More like letting everything settle like sediment, so I could see what was actually at the bottom. What I saw was not what I expected. Under the betrayal and the paperwork, and the carefully altered documents, I found my son. Not the version Bridget and Whitfield were constructing. The assembled, polished man in the blazer, making the right impressions at the right dinners. My actual son. The one who used to read books under the kitchen table because he didn't want to stop reading when dinner was served. The one who cried at the end of Charlotte's Web even though he was 12 and tried to pretend he hadn't. The one who, on the night before he left for college, had stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment before finally saying, "What if I'm not ready?" And I had told him the truth. No one is ever ready. You go anyway. He had gone. He had built something. And somewhere along the way, he had gotten lost inside someone else's idea of what that something should look like. I called him that evening. "I need you to come home again," I said. "Not to fight, just to talk." He was there by Friday. This time I cooked. Baked chicken, which was always his favorite. I set the table properly. Not because I was performing anything. Because I wanted him to walk in and feel like home still existed. I wasn't sure it did for him anymore, but I wanted to at least leave the door open. He came in looking tired. Not Atlanta tired, not performance tired. Actually tired. The kind of tired that settles in around the eyes when a person has been holding up too much for too long. We ate mostly in silence at first. Then I told him everything Leonard had found. I went slowly. I didn't editorialize. I just gave him the facts the same way I used to teach primary sources. Here is the document. Here is what it says. Here is what that means. By the time I finished, he had stopped eating. "Did she know?" he asked. His voice was different now. Something had gone out of it. "About her father's patterns, I can't say. About my name on that application. Cooper," she filed it. He sat back. I watched him work through it, the way I used to watch students work through a difficult passage. The first reading where nothing makes sense, then the second where it starts to, then the third where you can't unsee it. She told me it was fine, he said quietly. She told me it was just how these things were done. And you trusted her! I did. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. He looked down at it, then up at me, and for a moment he looked exactly 17 years old. Mom, he said, I left you out of my own wedding. You did, and you're sitting here feeding me chicken. I am. He laughed once, the broken kind, and then his eyes filled. He didn't cry. He's always held tears in until he's alone, which I'd got from me. But they were there. I am so sorry, he said, and I believed him. Not because the words were there. Words are easy. Because the way he said it had no performance in it. It was just a man who had done something wrong, sitting across from his mother, finally letting himself understand the full shape of it. I told him something I'd been holding for months. I spent years protecting you from consequences because I thought that was what love looked like. But somewhere in there, I think I accidentally taught you that your choices don't land. That there's always a soft place to fall and someone to fix the fall. I paused. I should have let some things hurt earlier. He was quiet for a long time. Then, is that why you didn't tell me about the monthly transfers? So you could just keep fixing things without me knowing? It was a fair question. It landed honestly. Probably, I said. Yes. After dinner, we sat on the back porch in the dark for a while. October in Columbus means cool air that still carries the last edge of summer warmth, if you sit still long enough to let it find you. Cooper wrapped his hands around a mug of tea and looked out at the garden. What happens with Leonard? He asked. I told him I hadn't decided yet. That would depend on what Bridget and her father decided to do. If they moved to protect themselves at Cooper's expense, Leonard was prepared. If they didn't, I had choices to make about how much I wanted to pursue versus simply protect. I don't want to destroy your marriage, I said. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not sure Bridget and I are going to make it, Mom. I've been thinking about that before any of this. I didn't push. Some things need to arrive at their own pace. I did tell him that regardless of what happened with the marriage, the financial support was changing. Not as punishment, as correction. He was 31 years old. He was capable. And he needed to know, fully and without a safety net, what it felt like to make his own choices and sit inside their consequences. He nodded slowly. He didn't argue. That itself told me something about how much had shifted in him over the past few weeks. Before he left the next morning, he stood in the doorway, the same way he had the night before college. He looked at me for a moment, then at the house around me. The bookshelves, the photographs, the worn table, the window above the kitchen sink that I'd been meaning to reglaze for 3 years. I want to come back for Christmas, he said. Just us. Something moved through me that I didn't try to name. I'd like that, I said. He drove away in the early gray of the morning. I stood on the porch until his car turned the corner. Then I went inside and poured a second cup of coffee and sat in the quiet. The lease issue worked itself out over the following months. Through a combination of Leonard's documents and a formal letter from Whitfield Hale's attorney. That was conciliatory in the way that only people with something to hide are conciliatory. I signed what needed to be signed. Nothing went to court. Whitfield's broader financial practices became someone else's problem to investigate, which eventually happened, quietly, about 6 months later. I didn't follow it closely. I had other things to tend. Cooper and Bridget did not make it. The separation came in January. He told me over the phone, and his voice had the particular flatness of someone reporting a fact they've already processed alone. I didn't say I saw it coming. I just asked how he was doing, really doing, and we talked for an hour in the way we hadn't talked since he was in his 20s. He moved back to Ohio that spring. Not into my house, into an apartment 15 minutes away, which was exactly the right distance. Close enough for Sunday dinners, far enough to grow. There was an afternoon in May when he came over to help me put in the tomato seedlings, and we worked side by side in the garden for 2 hours without talking much. Just the comfortable kind of quiet that two people can only have when they've gotten through something hard together. At some point, he held up a seedling and squinted at the roots. Is this one okay? It's a little stressed, I said. It'll come back if you're careful with it. He planted it anyway. We both watched it go into the ground. There are things that don't fully heal. I need to be honest about that. Some mornings I still think about the text, about the guest list, about writing a check for $12,000 toward a ceremony I was considered unfit to attend. Those memories don't disappear because the story found its way to something better. But here's what I've learned, at 63 years old, after everything. Love is not the same thing as endless accommodation. I spent 20 years building a soft place to land for my son and called it devotion. But devotion without truth is just avoidance dressed up in sentiment. Eventually, the truth comes anyway. The only question is whether it arrives early enough to still be useful. My son came back to me not because I rescued him. He came back because I finally stopped. And on Sunday mornings now, when he shows up at my door with coffee from the place down the street and sits at my kitchen table with his shoes still on, because he always forgets to take them off, and the light comes through the window the way it does in late spring, warm and ordinary, and entirely without performance, I think that is what I was actually saving all those years. Not the image of a family, the real one.